Benedict, the first pope in nearly 600 years to resign, was laid to rest in a simple service. Simple because that was in keeping with his wishes.
Un continuo consegnarsi nelle mani del Padre suo. Mani di perdono.
He was buried in the crypt of St. Peter. This is a funeral lacking in precedent. The reason? Pope Francis presided over the Mass for the Pope Emeritus. And the rituals of Pope Benedict's passing were less like those of a pontiff, monarch, or a vicar of Christ on earth. They were more akin to those of a retired bishop, even if he was buried in the red vestments of a Holy Father. Joining me on the morning show, Father Tom Willis, the Director of Liturgy for the Diocese of St. Augustine and Pastor of St. Mark, the Evangelist mission. Good morning. Good to have you here.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So Benedict leaves behind a very complicated legacy. Pope Francis in his homily didn't dwell on Benedict's legacy, delivering instead a meditation on Jesus' willingness to entrust himself to God's will. Were you surprised by that approach?
In one respect, yes, because if you remember when Pope John Paul II died, the last Bishop of Rome to have died, Benedict, who was then known as just Joseph Ratzinger, Cardinal Ratzinger, did speak a lot about the legacy, if you will, of John Paul II. But the one thing I've learned about Pope Francis, he is really a pastor at heart. And so the rituals of the church tell a pastor, you're not to eulogize, you're not to get off on those kind of judgment legacy homilies. And so he just took off straight from the scripture readings that were proclaimed and let that be what stated the Catholic Church's belief and prayer for the Pope Emeritus today.
And when you look at what happened today, the funeral was not on the same scale as that of John Paul in 2005. That funeral drew 3 million people to Rome. This one had, I think the number was 50,000, in large part, of course, because he was a Pope Emeritus, but also in context, there are many who say that Benedict was a scholar and theologian and not viewed with the same affection as his predecessor.
And yet you look that, according to reports, almost 250,000 people passed by his remains in St. Peter's Basilica over the last 3 days. I think it's one of those things where a reigning pontiff has a lot more ritual. The same thing we saw when Queen Elizabeth died last year. Things are a lot simpler, and maybe just because of that, but it's also very cold this morning in Rome in the low 40s from what I understood. So maybe that kept some people away.
There was an account written in Latin of his life and papacy on a document tucked inside the coffin, and it reads, "He fought with firmness against sexual abuse by the clergy in the church." While many leading figures have praised Benedict since his death, there have been many critics, including those of sexual abuse by clergy, who accused him of protecting the church at all costs. In the end, how do you expect history will remember Benedict?
His secretary, Archbishop Ganswein, spoke to that earlier this week. And one of the things that Archbishop Ganswein said is that we don't have the privilege of what happened behind the scenes. And certainly, and I think like anybody, when the first news of this hits and you have to have that first reaction, humanly, it's like, what? This happened? Please tell me no. But as he continued to have to lead the church's effort, first as the head of the Congregation for the Faith, then eventually as Pope, he was really one of the strongest opponents to allowing the sexual abusers to continue to have any kind of a public face or public ministry. He wanted to root that out as best as possible. It's probably one of those things that history over time, in that 70 to 80 year time frame when the archives will finally be open, that we'll be able to get a true understanding of what he was going through and how he was reading things in time.
There are some who say that Pope Francis has got to develop some sort of a protocol when it comes to the issue of retirement. And there are those who believe that Francis will ultimately retire himself. And though he was in a wheelchair today, it's basically because of his knee and not because it's, his retirement is impending anytime soon. But do you think that that is necessary? Because those who take a look at the canons of law say that there could be some misunderstanding as to who is in control of the church.
And sometimes with the faithful, that confusion happens. I don't think there's confusion at the upper levels of the church. Nonetheless, as the Pope, he is the supreme legislature, so he can enact laws and get things moving as he best sees fit. Remember, Benedict was the first Pope to resign in over 600 years. It was uncharted territory in modern times. And so we went through a period, we in a sense have had the trial run. Maybe the next iteration will help us refine it a little bit more, and Francis will be on the front lines to determine what those protocols will be.
That said, Benedict said that he would disappear after retirement, but his retirement lasted a little bit longer than he expected. 10 years in his papacy was 8, and some said had he not been as, and I think the word that I read was, as meek as he was, and Francis not as affable as he was, there could have been some struggles for control because Benedict was for the strict doctrine of the Catholic Church, and Francis is a reformer.
Well, but, and again, I think the Petrine ministry, the ministry of the Pope, is to hold the Church in unity. For Benedict, that unity was expressed primarily in teaching. His clarity of teaching and wanting people to unite in their understanding of Jesus as the Redeemer, as the Christ in that way. Whereas for Francis, his emphasis is still on Jesus and the way we unite ourselves in him, but through a ministry of service, especially to those on the margins.
So like the world is divided by politics these days, often religion is divided by politics, but it's the interpretation of issues.
Correct.
Father
Correct.
Tom, always good to see you, my friend. It's
Thanks,
been way
Bruce.
too long.
Thanks.
Appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.